The overhead fluorescent lights hummed like dying insects as Michael Chen gripped his briefcase so tightly his knuckles had gone white. At 19 years old, he stood in the marble corridors of CIA headquarters, surrounded by men twice his age, who moved with the quiet confidence of people who knew how to kill without leaving evidence. His reflections stared back from the polished floor. A Chinese-American kid from San Francisco who'd been recruited straight out of his first semester at Berkeley, now wearing an ill-fitting suit that smelled like mothballs and broken dreams. The year was 1962, and somewhere across the world, Soviet missiles were pointing at American cities, while diplomats smiled for cameras and planned for Armageddon. Michael had imagined adventure when he'd signed those papers in a windowless room 3 months ago. But now, standing here with orders that would send him behind enemy lines, all he felt was the acidic burn of terror rising in his throat. A secretary with perfect lipstick and cold eyes gestured him toward a door marked only with numbers, no names, nothing to indicate what happened inside. Michael's shoes squeaked against the floor as he walked, each step echoing like a countdown. Through the walls, he could hear typewriters clattering out secrets, phones ringing with intelligence from Moscow and Havana and Berlin, the machinery of espionage grinding forward whether he was ready or not. His father's voice echoed in his memory, warning him that people like them, immigrants who'd built lives from nothing, should keep their heads down and stay invisible. But Michael had wanted to prove something, to show he belonged in this country that still looked at his face and saw an outsider, and now belonging meant walking into the kind of danger that turned young men into ghosts. The door opened before he could knock, and a man with grey temples and a scar above his left eyebrow studied him with eyes that had watched empires crumble. Behind him, maps covered every wall, pins marking locations where agents operated in shadows, where one wrong word meant a bullet in a dark alley. The man didn't smile, didn't offer false comfort, just looked at Michael the way a general might assess a soldier before sending him into fire. Outside the window, Washington sprawled in autumn sunlight, free and loud and alive, but Michael knew that in 48 hours he'd be somewhere very different, somewhere the sun barely seemed to reach. His first field assignment waited in a manila folder on the desk, and with it, the moment when everything he thought he knew about courage would be tested against the brutal reality of the Cold War. The man with the scar gestured to a leather chair that wheezed when Michael sat, and suddenly 3 other men materialized from corners he hadn't noticed, surrounding the desk like judges at a trial where the verdict had already been decided. The eldest among them, a colonel whose chest displayed ribbons from wars Michael had only read about in textbooks, pushed the manila folder forward with 2 fingers, as if the paper itself carried contagion. Inside, black and white photographs showed a city split down its middle like a broken skull, concrete barriers and barbed wire dividing families who could see each other's windows but might never touch again. "East Berlin," the colonel said, his voice carrying the weight of cigarettes and classified briefings, where Soviet power had erected a monument to fear just 14 months ago, trapping millions behind what the world now called the Wall. Michael's hands trembled as he studied the photographs showing checkpoints bristling with armed guards, watchtowers casting shadows over empty streets where people walked with their eyes down and their thoughts hidden. The mission briefing unfolded in clinical terms that couldn't mask its danger. Coded documents containing intelligence on Soviet troop movements needed delivery to an asset embedded deep in East German territory, a man whose identity Michael would know only by a recognition phrase about weather that never came. The dead drop location was marked on a map with a red circle, a park bench near Alexanderplatz where surveillance cameras couldn't quite reach, where Michael would sit at precisely 1400 hours and leave a newspaper containing secrets that could shift the balance of power. The colonel explained how East Berlin operated as a prison wrapped in propaganda, where the Stasi secret police maintained files on millions of citizens, where neighbors informed on neighbors and children reported their parents' whispered doubts about the communist paradise. They showed him photographs of Stasi agents, men with ordinary faces who could disappear you into basements where screams went unheard and questions never stopped. The surveillance network in East Berlin exceeded anything in human history, they warned. Cameras and informants creating a web so tight that even breathing felt like confession, where every conversation might be recorded and every stranger could be state security. Michael would travel as a student researcher studying Cold War architecture, a cover story thin as rice paper but necessary because no disguise could survive real scrutiny in a city designed to catch spies. The documents would be sewn into his briefcase lining, undetectable unless they tore it apart, which they would if suspicion landed on him even for a moment. The briefing ended with a question that wasn't really a question. The scarred man asking if Michael understood that capture meant disavowal, that America would deny his existence while he rotted in a Stasi cell or faced a firing squad in some forgotten courtyard. Michael heard himself say yes, though his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone braver than the terrified teenager whose childhood had been piano lessons and baseball games, not preparation for walking into the teeth of an empire that devoured people like him without leaving bones behind. The taxi dropped Michael at Checkpoint Charlie just after dawn, when the November cold turned breath into ghosts and made his hands ache inside thin gloves that couldn't hide their shaking. He joined a line of silent travelers, shuffling toward the barrier where two worlds collided, where the bright advertisements and bustling energy of West Berlin died against concrete and barbed wire that stretched toward a gray horizon. American soldiers checked his papers with bored efficiency, their casual competence a final reminder of the freedom he was about to leave behind, then waved him forward into the no-man's land where neither side claimed responsibility for what happened in the shadows. The East German guards who took his passport moved with mechanical precision, their faces carved from the same concrete as the wall itself, eyes trained to see guilt in every nervous gesture, and hesitation. The architecture beyond the checkpoint struck Michael like a physical blow, Soviet-style buildings rising in brutal repetitions of grey stone and empty windows that stared down like dead eyes judging the living. Streets that must have once held character and color now wore uniformity like a shroud, every surface designed to remind citizens that individual expression died where the state began, that beauty was bourgeois and conformity was survival. Propaganda posters plastered on walls showed workers with impossible smiles celebrating production quotas, while real people hurried past with shoulders hunched and faces carefully blank, moving through their city like prisoners on supervised exercise. The air itself tasted different here, heavy with coal smoke and something else Michael couldn't name, the weight of constant surveillance turning oxygen into suspicion that settled in his lungs. He felt the watchers before he saw them, that animal instinct humans develop when predator eyes track their movement through hostile territory. A man in a grey coat reading a newspaper that never turned its pages, a woman adjusting her scarf while her gaze followed Michael's reflection in shop windows, ordinary people performing ordinary actions with extraordinary attention, focused on the foreign student with a briefcase full of treason. The Stasi operated everywhere and nowhere, his briefers had warned. A secret police force so vast that 1 in every 60 East Germans worked as informants, creating a nation where trust died and paranoia became rational survival strategy. Michael's chest tightened with each step toward Alexanderplatz, the documents sewn into his briefcase suddenly feeling heavy as corpses, obvious as blood on snow. The suffocating certainty that he'd made a terrible mistake wrapped around Michael's throat as he walked deeper into enemy territory, every face a potential agent and every shadow a place where people disappeared. This wasn't the adventure he'd imagined in training rooms where danger felt theoretical. and consequences were just words in briefing folders. This was the reality of a city designed to trap souls, where the wall kept people in rather than out, and where a Chinese-American teenager carrying secrets might simply vanish into the machinery of state terror without even making the news. His watch showed 2 hours until the dead drop, 120 minutes. Of walking these oppressive streets while pretending his heart wasn't hammering against his ribs and his mind wasn't screaming to run back toward the checkpoint, toward home, toward anywhere but this monument to controlled fear, where even breathing felt like resistance. The man in the grey coat had followed Michael through 3 turns and 2 unnecessary detours, maintaining perfect distance like a predator matching the rhythm of wounded prey. Michael's training screamed at him to stay calm, to continue toward the dead drop at Marx Engels Platz as planned, but his instinct whispered the truth his handlers had never wanted him to understand, that protocols written in comfortable Virginia offices meant nothing in streets where the Stasi had spent years perfecting the art of human hunting. He ducked into a department store, where shoppers moved between empty shelves with the mechanical determination of people pretending abundance existed in scarcity, weaving through aisles while watching reflections in glass counters that showed grey coat entering 20 paces behind, casual and patient and utterly certain of his advantage. The briefcase felt like it was burning against Michael's ribs, where he'd transferred it beneath his coat. The documents inside suddenly transformed from intelligence assets into death warrants that would condemn him to basement interrogation. Rooms where American citizenship meant nothing and screaming meant less. Panic tasted like copper in Michael's mouth as he exited onto a side street where morning workers trudged toward factories that pumped black smoke into winter sky, all of them too focused on survival to notice the foreign student whose shallow breathing and darting eyes marked him as clearly as blood in watermarks, shark's prey. The dead drop was compromised, had to be compromised if they were already following him, which meant the asset waiting at Marx Engels Platz was probably being photographed and catalogued for arrest the moment Michael appeared. His briefers' voices echoed uselessly in his memory, with their confident assurances about extraction protocols and emergency procedures, bureaucratic fantasies that assumed spies controlled their operations rather than operations controlling spies who found themselves trapped in cities designed specifically to prevent escape. Michael's legs carried him forward through streets that all looked identical, past buildings that loomed like tombstones, marking where hope came to die, while his mind raced through impossible calculations, trying to find safety where none existed. A cafe appeared ahead, warm light spilling onto frozen sidewalk like an oasis in this desert of concrete conformity, its windows fogged with steam and crowded with people seeking brief refuge from the cold that seeped from stone and state alike. Michael pushed through the door into air, thick with cigarette smoke and weak coffee, into noise and bodies pressed together at small tables, into the perfect chaos where surveillance became difficult and desperate men could attempt desperate improvisation. Grey coat would follow within. Seconds, Michael knew, would watch and wait, and eventually call for backup when the stupid American boy finally accepted that this city permitted no escape from its efficient machinery of observation and control. The realization hit Michael with crystalline clarity that cut through panic like light through prison bars. He couldn't make the dead drop, couldn't reach the asset, couldn't follow any protocol without condemning himself and everyone connected to this operation, which meant his only choice was something so reckless and unplanned that perhaps it might work precisely because no trained Stasi agent would believe anyone could be that foolish. His eyes scanned the crowded cafe with new purpose, searching faces until they landed on a man reading a British newspaper, Western clothes marking him as clearly foreign as Michael's own Chinese features marked him as unusual, a journalist or businessman trapped by circumstance in this divided city where walls separated not just geography, but entire philosophies of human Existence. Michael moved through the crowded cafe with calculated clumsiness, his hands trembling not from fear alone, but from the deliberate performance of a nervous tourist, overwhelmed by foreign surroundings. The journalist sat near the back corner, his British newspaper folded beside a worn leather briefcase that hung from his chair like an answered prayer, close enough to reach but far enough that the attempt would require commitment. Steam rose from cheap porcelain cups around them, while conversations murmured in German, creating a symphony of ordinary life that Michael needed to pierce with precisely calibrated chaos. He ordered coffee in broken German, loud enough to mark himself as American, clumsy enough to seem harmless, while his peripheral vision tracked Grey Coat entering through the door behind him, finding a position by the window where observation became effortless. The cup felt fragile in Michael's sweating hands as he turned from the counter, documents pressed against his ribs beneath his coat, heart hammering against the papers that represented either salvation or damnation, depending on the next 30 seconds. He let himself stumble slightly, just enough to establish the pattern, a tourist disoriented by the oppressive atmosphere of this city, where even coffee tasted like surveillance and suspicion. The collision happened with the messy authenticity of genuine accident. Michael lurching forward as his foot caught a chair leg, hot coffee arcing through smoke-thick air in a spray that caught the journalist across his newspaper and pressed wool coat. Apologies tumbled from Michael's mouth in panicked English, while his hands moved with practiced precision beneath the chaos, pulling the documents from inside his coat during the frantic dabbing and wiping, sliding them into the open briefcase during the confusion of offered napkins and embarrassed gestures. The journalist sputtered indignation in clipped British tones, more annoyed than suspicious, reacting to ruined clothing rather than espionage, while other patrons turned to watch the spectacle with the hungry attention of people whose lives contained too little entertainment. Michael's fingers completed their work in the space between heartbeats, depositing classified intelligence into foreign hands, through methods no training manual had ever conceived, transforming state secrets into cafe debris that disappeared into leather. Darkness. Grey Coat watched from his window position with the flat expression of a predator observing prey behavior that seemed too stupid to warrant immediate action, seeing only American clumsiness rather than operational brilliance, disguised as incompetence. Michael backed away, still apologizing, leaving money on the journalist's table for cleaning costs, playing the mortified tourist role with commitment that bordered on art. The documents were gone from his possession, transformed from burning evidence into someone else's problem, crossing from his desperate hands into circulation beyond Stasi, reached through channels of accident rather than intention. His body felt suddenly lighter. Despite the sweat soaking his shirt beneath winter clothes, the terrible weight of classified papers replaced by the different terror of uncertainty about whether his improvisation would succeed or merely distribute his failure across multiple victims. The journalist gathered his things with British efficiency, stuffing napkins and newspaper into his briefcase atop the documents he didn't know he carried, preparing to leave this cafe and this encounter behind like a minor inconvenience in a city full of larger troubles. Grey Coat remained motionless by the window, still watching Michael rather than the departing Westerner, his trained eyes focused on the obvious foreign student rather than the authentic accident that had just transformed surveillance reality into operational fiction. Michael ordered another coffee with shaking hands that no longer required performance, drinking bitter liquid while his mind raced through implications and consequences. The journalist disappeared through the door into cold Berlin morning, carrying secrets toward Checkpoint Charlie, where Western passports meant freedom and leather briefcases received cursory inspection rather than thorough search. Grey Coat finally approached Michael's table, sitting down uninvited with the casual authority of men who operated beyond normal social contracts, asking questions in careful English about tourist destinations and travel purposes, while eyes that had witnessed thousands of interrogations searched for deception in a face too young to hide much successfully. Michael answered with the honest confusion of someone who had genuinely spilled coffee and genuinely felt embarrassed, his cover story protected by the reality that he no longer possessed. Anything incriminating except memories and training that his trembling hands and nervous sweat made invisible beneath the performance of ordinary fear that any American might feel when confronted by Eastern authority in a city designed to generate exactly that response. Michael approached Checkpoint Charlie as afternoon shadows stretched across the death strip, his empty coat feeling conspicuous despite containing nothing more incriminating than a tourist map and worthless East German currency that nobody wanted. The crossing point rose before him like a temple to suspicion, its wooden barriers and concrete guard towers manned by soldiers whose youth made their automatic weapons seem even more dangerous, fingers resting near triggers with the casual readiness of men who had been taught that shooting was preferable to thinking. Lines of people waited in silent queues that moved with bureaucratic slowness, each person becoming a problem to be solved through stamped papers and invasive questions that transformed human beings into potential threats requiring documentation and proof. Winter wind carried coal smoke and exhaust fumes through the checkpoint corridor, creating atmosphere thick enough to taste, bitter on the tongue, like the fear that radiated from every traveler who understood that border crossings between ideologies represented moments when individual lives mattered least. The first inspection booth swallowed Michael into fluorescent sterility, a concrete room where officials in green uniforms processed his passport with theatrical slowness, turning pages as if secrets might be hidden between stamps and visas from countries he had never visited. Questions came in accented English about his purpose in the workers' paradise, his accommodation details, his contacts within the socialist sector, each answer recorded in ledgers that would be analyzed by men in distant offices who built careers from suspicious patterns in tourist behavior. His bag received methodical examination, contents spread across metal tables under lights bright enough to reveal every fiber and thread, searching for microfilm or coded messages or whatever contraband their training manuals suggested young Americans might attempt to smuggle through ideological barriers. Michael's heartbeat thundered in his ears, while maintaining the confused politeness of someone who believed documentation entitled him to movement, playing the role of innocent traveler who failed to understand that innocence itself appeared suspicious in places where paranoia had become institutional policy. Then Grey Coat appeared in the doorway behind the inspectors, his presence transforming routine processing into something darker and more dangerous, speaking rapid German that shifted the atmosphere from bureaucratic to predatory. The official's expressions changed from bored efficiency to focused intensity, returning to Michael's bag with renewed purpose, checking seams and linings with fingers that probed for hidden compartments, while Grey Coat watched with eyes that had already decided guilt and merely sought confirmation. Michael forced himself to meet that gaze with tourist confusion rather than operational terror, asking in English what the problem was, whether his papers lacked proper stamps, maintaining the performance even as sweat traced cold lines down his spine beneath clothing that suddenly felt thin as tissue. Grey Coat circled him slowly, speaking English now, asking about the cafe incident, about coffee and journalists and clumsy Americans who appeared in sensitive locations during sensitive times, questions designed to crack composure and reveal the trained operative beneath the student disguise. The interrogation stretched across minutes that felt like hours, Grey Coat's voice never rising above conversational tone, while implying consequences that required no elaboration in a city where basements held soundproofed rooms and disappearances required no explanation to authorities who answered to no law beyond security. Michael stuck to truth wherever possible, admitting the spill, admitting embarrassment, his genuine nervousness About this conversation, providing cover for deeper fears about missions and documents that had hopefully crossed this same checkpoint hours earlier in British hands. Finally, Greycoat nodded to the inspectors with visible reluctance. Some calculation determining that holding an American student without evidence created more problems than releasing a possible operative without proof. Cold War mathematics, where diplomatic incidents outweighed intelligence concerns. Michael gathered his scattered belongings with hands that shook authentically, walking through the final barrier into West Berlin's chaotic freedom, not allowing himself to run, despite every instinct screaming that safety required. Distance and speed and borders between himself and men, whose suspicions he had survived by nothing more substantial than youth and accident and the document's absence from his possession. The safe house occupied a third-floor apartment in Charlottenburg, where peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceilings suggested bohemian poverty rather than intelligence operations, its windows overlooking a courtyard where laundry lines and domestic arguments provided cover for conversations that governments would pay fortunes to overhear. Michael sat in a wooden chair that creaked with every nervous shift of weight, facing three men whose expressions revealed nothing about whether this debriefing would end with commendation or consequences that terminated careers before they properly began. Handler Wilson chain-smoked American cigarettes that filled the room with blue haze, while two analysts Michael didn't recognize studied folders containing reports about cafe incidents and border delays, documents that transformed his terrified improvisation into bureaucratic text, stripped of context and fear. The radiator clanked and hissed in the corner, its inadequate heat doing nothing to stop the cold that radiated from Michael's center outward. The bone-deep chill of understanding that missions survived did not guarantee approval from men who valued procedure above results. Wilson finally spoke after silence that stretched beyond comfort into deliberate intimidation, his voice carrying Boston inflections that sounded almost friendly, despite words that dissected Michael's operational decisions with surgical precision. He reviewed the failed dead drop without emotion, the Stasi tale that suggested either bad luck or compromised protocols, the documents that had traveled through enemy territory in unauthorized hands toward destinations that might include foreign intelligence services or morning trash bins, depending on journalistic whim. Michael began formulating apologies and explanations that died unspoken when Wilson's expression shifted from critique to something approaching fascination, asking him to recreate the cafe moment with exact detail about positioning and timing and the journalist's reaction to coffee-soaked clothing. The analysts leaned forward with sudden interest that confused Michael more than anger would have, their questions focusing not on his protocol violations, but on surveillance blind spots created by crowds and commotion and the authentic chaos of genuine accidents that counterintelligence training never anticipated, because paranoia required patterns and improvisation created none. Then, understanding rippled through the room, like revelation passing between priests who had witnessed unexpected miracles. Wilson stubbing out his cigarette with decisive pressure that sent sparks across the ashtray's chipped porcelain. They weren't analyzing failure, but discovering technique, recognizing that Michael's panicked coffee spill had accomplished what traditional tradecraft increasingly couldn't in cities where watchers studied dead drops and brush passes. With professional expertise that turned standard procedures into traps, the Stasi agent had witnessed an embarrassed student apologizing to an annoyed journalist, a moment so mundane it generated no suspicion because it contained no operational signature, no practice smoothness that marked professionals working under journalistic or diplomatic cover. Michael's fear had sold the performance perfectly, his genuine nervousness reading as social anxiety rather than espionage terror, creating transfer method that appeared completely natural, because in that moment of improvisation it had been natural, authenticity that no amount of training could properly replicate, because real panic possessed textures that performance always lacked. Wilson stood and extended his hand with respect that felt more unsettling than punishment would have, telling Michael that his quick thinking had not only completed the mission, but potentially revolutionized how they operated in surveillance-heavy environments where traditional methods had become suicide. The analyst began discussing refinements and applications, while Michael sat processing the revelation that his terrified mistake had somehow transformed into innovation, wondering whether intelligence work always involved this strange alchemy, where failure and success occupied the same moment, depending entirely on interpretation and outcome. Outside the safe house windows, West Berlin conducted its nervous evening rituals, a city that had learned to celebrate survival while surrounded by walls and ideology, and the constant possibility that tomorrow might bring tanks instead of dawn. Moscow arrived in winter when Gorky Park froze solid and exhaust from ZIL limousines hung in air thick enough to taste metal and petrol, the city's grey monumentalism amplified by snow that turned black within hours of falling. Michael stood beside a magazine kiosk on Arbat Street, wearing a check overcoat that smelled of mothballs and previous owners, watching his breath crystallize while pretending interest in Pravda headlines that proclaimed agricultural triumphs contradicted by empty shop windows 3 blocks away. The asset worked in a ministry building whose Stalinist architecture suggested power through sheer oppressive mass. A man whose access to satellite intelligence reports made him invaluable, and whose increasing paranoia made traditional contact methods impossible. In the city where the Committee for State Security watched its own employees with sociopathic dedication, Wilson had briefed Michael in Helsinki with clinical precision about engineering accidents that appeared genuine, transforming panicked improvisation into repeatable technique, though fear still tasted the same, regardless of whether protocol sanctioned it or training attempted to systematize spontaneity that only desperation properly motivated. The asset emerged at 17 minutes past noon, carrying a briefcase that contained either documents worth killing for or lunch and paperwork, depending on whether his nerve held, his pace suggesting a man walking toward routine rather than treason. Michael timed his approach through crowd mathematics and peripheral vision, stumbling with practiced clumsiness into the asset's path while fumbling a stack of tourist maps that scattered across ice-slicked pavement. The collision looked utterly authentic because Michael's racing heartbeat sold every gesture, his apologetic Russian carrying student accent that matched his cover documentation, hands retrieving fallen maps while the asset's briefcase exchanged itself for an identical case during commotion that surveillance teams would review later, finding nothing but awkward foreigners and Moscow's perpetual irritation. The asset accepted stammered apologies with bureaucratic coldness that never broke character, walking away with maps containing microfilm secreted in their folds, while Michael clutched documents hidden in a briefcase, now destined for dead drops, that traditional watchers would never connect to magazine kiosks or tourist clumsiness witnessed by hundreds. Prague came in spring when Soviet tanks still occupied intersections as reminders of what happened to socialism with human faces, the city's baroque beauty militarized into submission. Michael practiced his accident in Wenceslas Square, where reformed protesters walked carefully and spoke quietly, bumping into assets outside tram stations and theater entrances, perfecting the choreography of chaos until transfers happened in moments too brief and cluttered for watchers to reconstruct. Each operation refined the technique further, stripping away excess movement and suspicious timing until only authentic awkwardness remained, the method working precisely because it contained no method that analysts could identify or training could. Prepare agents to recognize among thousands of daily collisions occurring in cities where crowds provided both cover and witnesses. Warsaw followed in summer when humidity turned the Vistula into soup and party officials retreated to dachas, while Michael worked streets near the Palace of Culture, that Stalinist gift towering over Polish resentment. Like occupation-made architecture, he taught himself to read surveillance patterns in the rhythm of footsteps behind him and the placement of vehicles that appeared coincidentally too often, developing instincts that transformed paranoia into operational awareness. Each successful transfer building confidence that felt dangerous because comfort bred carelessness, and carelessness in these grey cities bred consequences measured in years behind walls where screaming went unheard. The training facility occupied a converted warehouse in Virginia, where afternoon light filtered through windows painted over for security, creating the perpetual twilight of classified operations where young recruits learned tradecraft that couldn't be written in manuals or acknowledged in congressional oversight. Michael stood before 12 faces younger than his own, 21 years, recognizing the mix of eagerness and terror he'd carried through Checkpoint Charlie, when improvisation meant survival rather than curriculum, when accidents happened. From desperation, instead of design rehearsed in rooms smelling of coffee and chalk dust, Wilson watched from the back with arms crossed, transformed from field handler to training supervisor, his presence reminding everyone that techniques born in crisis now required systematization, even as something vital died when panic became procedure and authentic fear transformed into performance repeated until muscle memory replaced genuine reaction. The recruits practiced collisions against each other in mock crowds created from furniture and impatience, their movements too careful and choreographed, lacking the chaotic urgency that made transfers invisible to watchers who'd spent careers identifying patterns in human behavior. Michael demonstrated again, letting his body remember Berlin cafes and Moscow ice rather than instruction manuals, stumbling into a volunteer with graceless authenticity that scattered props across linoleum floors scarred by similar exercises. The difference registered immediately in student faces. Recognition that real accidents contained elements impossible to script, the fumbling recovery and embarrassed apologies carrying conviction that rehearsal murdered. One recruit named Patterson kept asking about contingencies and fallback protocols, his engineering mind seeking algorithms for situations that defied systematic approach, unable to accept that effectiveness came from abandoning method entirely and trusting improvisation born from circumstances no briefing could anticipate. They studied surveillance footage from Eastern Bloc operations, watching grainy transfers that appeared genuine because desperation authenticated every gesture. Michael's own Berlin encounter replayed, until he stopped seeing himself and recognized only a terrified teenager who'd accidentally discovered that authenticity defeated sophisticated counterintelligence through sheer, unremarkable humanity. The recruits took notes as though spontaneity could be captured in margins, their careful documentation missing the essential truth that technique worked only when operators forgot training and responded to immediate crisis. Wilson lectured about Moscow rules and Prague protocols, while Michael remembered the taste of fear and coffee, how his hands had shaken, not from practiced nervousness, but genuine terror that transformed clumsy fiction into truth that surveillance teams couldn't distinguish from thousands of daily accidents occurring in cities where watching everyone meant seeing nothing. The standardization felt like betrayal somehow, taking something born from panic in divided cities and reducing it to curriculum taught in Virginia warehouses where safety permitted practice and repetition killed the authentic. Desperation that made transfers invisible. Michael taught because duty required it, and because handlers recognized that operators who'd survived fieldwork possessed knowledge textbooks couldn't contain. Yet each class diminished the technique further as students learned performance instead of experiencing the genuine chaos that only enemy, territory and discovery's consequences properly motivated. Michael retired from the agency on a November afternoon when Berlin Wall fragments were being sold as souvenirs, and the Soviet Union existed only in history books. His departure documented in personnel files that would remain classified for decades after his death. The training facility had moved 3 times during his tenure, evolving from converted warehouses to purpose-built complexes where his accidental technique occupied entire modules in curriculum taught to recruits who'd never known a world divided by ideology and concrete. He cleaned out a desk drawer containing commendations he couldn't display and operational photographs from cities that had changed names or ceased existing, the faces of assets and handlers now scattered across continents or buried in cemeteries where gravestones couldn't mention how they'd died. Wilson had retired 8 years earlier, their final conversation consisting of silences that acknowledged shared knowledge of when improvisation became doctrine and desperation transformed into something teachable but fundamentally different from its desperate origin in a Berlin cafe where a terrified teenager had stumbled into tradecraft. The agency offered consulting contracts and advisory positions that Michael declined, recognizing he'd become a relic of conflicts fought in shadows before satellites and digital encryption made human intelligence simultaneously more valuable and more vulnerable. He kept newspaper clippings about Cold War revelations and declassifications, reading accounts of operations where his technique had prevented captures or facilitated transfers, the journalists never knowing that accidents they reported as coincidence had been engineered by operators trained in Virginia facilities. Sometimes former students contacted him through careful intermediaries, their messages containing gratitude for training that had saved their lives in fieldwork situations where traditional methods would have triggered alarms. Michael rarely responded, uncertain whether his contribution represented innovation or whether he'd simply been fortunate enough to panic effectively when consequences included torture chambers beneath East German buildings that no longer existed except in survivor testimonies. The epilogue to his career existed in classified after-action reports analyzing technique, effectiveness across 4 decades of implementation, statistics measuring successful transfers against compromised operations where performance failed to achieve authentic appearance. Historians who eventually gained access to declassified materials would debate whether the method represented tactical brilliance or fortunate accident that the agency had systematized beyond its natural application. Michael appeared in several paragraphs of intelligence histories published after the millennium, identified only as a young operative whose Berlin improvisation had influenced Cold War tradecraft. He died quietly in a retirement community where neighbors knew nothing of his past. His memorial service, attended by elderly men who stood with military bearing and spoke carefully around the edges of classified memories they still couldn't legally acknowledge. The technique outlived its creator and the conflict that had necessitated its development, adapted for modern intelligence operations where surveillance technology made traditional dead drops obsolete, but human psychology remained constant. Training instructors still taught variations in facilities Michael would barely recognize, the essential principles surviving even as specific applications evolved beyond anything he would have imagined while spilling coffee in a Berlin cafe. His contribution existed in the absence of disasters, in transfers completed and assets protected, in the negative space of captures prevented and tortures avoided through methods appearing too mundane for watchers to recognize as tradecraft. The teenager who'd improvised from terror became a footnote in intelligence history, his panic transformed into doctrine that survived the ideological conflict that had created the necessity for young men to carry secrets through cities where discovery meant death and authentic accidents, provided the only cover sophisticated enough to defeat those trained to see through every deception. What moment in your life changed everything without you realizing it at the time? Subscribe to Discover more untold stories from history's shadows.